Mr. Bryan. Amy Swearer.
Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Cornyn, and distinguished senators. My name is Amy Swearer. I'm a senior legal fellow at the Heritage Foundation's Ed Meese Center for Legal and Judicial Studies. Here we are, once again, holding a congressional hearing on gun violence. This time, the chosen lens is that of public health. Despite the slightly different title, it's effectively the same hearing as the last several gun hearings to which I've been called to testify. To be completely honest, I don't have much to say that's different from what I've said in my previous testimonies. Believe me, I'm not being flippant. It's just that using a public health lens hasn't changed the discussion. Put aside that the end goal of many of those pushing the public health framing is often either to use crisis language as an end run around the Constitution or to pathologize the right to keep and bear arms. Put aside, too, that the public health lens is not particularly useful for understanding and addressing a problem that stems at its core not so much from a lack of insight into how violence affects health as from a lack of adequately enforcing criminal laws and utilizing existing mental health frameworks. If we take the issue of gun violence seriously from a public health perspective, none of the problems or solutions have changed. A public health framework doesn't change, for instance, the fact that most gun crimes are perpetrated not by ordinary lawful gun owners, but by a small subset of repeat offenders who are already prohibited from owning guns. It's still the case that if our policing, bail, and prosecutorial policies immediately spit these repeat violent offenders back into the community without pursuing criminal prosecution or punishment, they will predictably keep committing violent crimes. A public health lens doesn't change the fact that most gun deaths are suicides, but half of suicides are carried out with something other than a firearm. So pathologizing a specific weapon remains far less useful than talking about all lethal means during a personal crisis and dealing with hard underlying truths about the nationwide mental health crisis. It certainly doesn't change the fact that most of the gun control restrictions commonly proposed to deal with criminal violence and suicide, things like assault weapons bans, magazine capacity restrictions, punitive public carry laws, and so on, are not even remotely designed to meaningfully address any major factors underlying crime or suicide. And a public health lens doesn't fix the constitutional or practical concerns about implementing these policies, nor does it erase the fundamental importance of the right to keep and bear arms to the natural right of self-defense. And so my proposals for how Congress should move forward may sound pretty familiar. Among other things that I've outlined in my 35 pages of written submission, Congress can and should pursue the following. First, Congress can start right here in Washington, D.C., where the D.C. City Council's reform efforts have created a crime tsunami under which the district's residents are currently drowning. Congress should exercise its plenary authority and pass a modern, comprehensive criminal code for the district, including a mandatory sentencing scheme for the Superior Court judges. It should strip the D.C. Office of Attorney General of the authority to prosecute all crimes and give that to the D.C. U.S. Attorney's Office. It should federalize the D.C. Crime Lab and give that to the FBI. Second, Congress can and should rein in federal agencies like ATF when they shift their time and attention to over-regulating peaceable citizens instead of targeting violent criminals who actually threaten public safety. Third, Congress can compel the military branches to better share with civilian authorities all relevant information about service members who clearly pose a danger to themselves or their communities. Last month's shooting by a mentally ill Army reservist in Lewiston, Maine, was not the first time the military's failure to share such information resulted in preventable tragedy. Congress can ensure that it is the last. Fourth, instead of spending so much time pathologizing and demonizing specific mechanisms of violence, Congress can turn its attention toward promoting economic growth and easing crushing inflation rates. No, that's not nearly as sexy as calling for an assault weapons ban, but reducing economic stress, poverty, and family instability lowers a person's overall risk of suicide far more than requiring his or her rifle to be featureless. Senators, if today is an average day, by the time we finish this hearing in about 3 hours, roughly 8 Americans will have been murdered, about twice as many will have killed themselves, and countless others will have been violently victimized. Much of that violence will involve firearms. This is antithetical to human flourishing, to the rule of law, and to civil society. It's a problem worth understanding accurately and addressing meaningfully. And so I am happy to come back and repeat the same testimony as many times as you ask me to. And I will explain the same potential courses of action as often as it takes for Congress to do not just something, but the right things. I once again look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Swear. Dr. Ranney.
Chair Durbin, Senator Cornyn, and members of the committee, thank you for conducting this hearing and recognizing gun violence as a health crisis. I am a board-certified emergency physician and dean of the Yale School of Public Health. I've spent nearly 20 years working as an emergency physician in a top-tier trauma center. Here in the U.S., treating firearm injuries is a routine part of emergency medicine. During our training, we learn how to identify who must go right to an operating room, how to crack the chest of someone who's bleeding out, and how to notify family members of a death. While in training, though, we rarely, if ever, learn to ask what could be done to prevent a gunshot wound in the first place. That changed for me about 15 years ago, after I cared for a young man, the son of a first responder, who had shot himself with his parents' firearm. He was the first patient I'd cared for who had intentionally shot himself. I couldn't save him, but he changed my perspective on gun violence. First, his death drove me to learn more about firearm suicide, to realize that in the emergency department, we rarely saw suicide attempts from a gun, not because they were rare, but because they were so often fatal. Second, his death led me to question why we didn't think about gunshot wounds the same way we think about drunk driving or heart disease, as something we can and should prevent. Most disturbingly, I noticed the difference in how my colleagues responded to this suicide compared to the everyday toll of community gun violence. Since that case, I have treated people for every type of firearm injury, from domestic violence to victims of drive-bys. I've saved some lives, but not all, and have informed countless families of the loss of their loved ones. And it is because I have had a front row seat to our nation's growing firearm injury epidemic that I have worked to define and implement a public health approach to this crisis. To clarify, this is how a public health approach works. First, we gather data on the problem. How common is it and who is affected? Second, we define risk and protective factors. What increases or decreases the chance of someone being hurt or dying? Third, we figure out programs that work to change those patterns, to avert injury, hospitalization, or death. And finally, we scale what works. We have example after example of how this four-step approach, when applied systematically, can improve human health without abrogating rights. For example, we decreased car crash deaths, as Chairman Durbin mentioned, by more than 70% over the last few decades, despite more cars being on the road, by quantifying the problem, identifying risk factors, developing multifaceted solutions, ranging from reducing drunk driving to putting airbags in cars, and then by scaling what worked. Unfortunately, we have not yet consistently applied this approach to firearm injury. As a result, we are facing a growing epidemic. America's total number of gun deaths is the highest on record, and our rate nears its peak. Firearm deaths have surpassed breast cancer deaths in America. Firearms are now the leading cause of death for American children age 1 through 19. Although mass shootings get the most media attention, 2/3 of firearm deaths are preventable suicides, averaged over the last decade, like that young man I cared for 15 years ago. The remainder are mostly community violence and, to a lesser extent, domestic violence. Although there are clear risk factors and disparities, it is a problem that affects all of us. More than half of American adults say that they or a family member has been involved in a shooting. More than 3/4 say the fear of gun violence has led them to change something in their lives. The effects of this epidemic are wide and long, ranging from immediate medical costs, estimated by the Government Accountability Office at $1 billion a year, to long-term mental health, economic, and educational impacts. Mothers, fathers, friends, as well as first responders, all experience anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress after a nearby shooting. These dismal statistics aside, as an ER doc and public health dean, I have confidence we can turn the tide. 4 things are needed to help us apply this public health approach successfully: improved data, improved research funding, improved training of healthcare and public health professionals and community members to help us recognize and act on risk, and most of all, improved collaboration with the most affected communities, whether rural or urban. And this is where we need your help. First, help us get better data so Americans can better measure, predict, and evaluate this health crisis. You can make this happen, whether by funding data modernization for the CDC or by removing barriers to data sharing amongst state, territorial, and local partners, as Utah has done. Help us with federal funding for research to develop and evaluate solutions. At a minimum, continue current levels of appropriations for the NIH and CDC, but ideally appropriate more. Help us by supporting our scaling up and training of folks on things that do work. I'm happy to talk about this in Q&A. And finally, help our country have hope by demonstrating collaborative action, as you have done before. We are turning into a nation of traumatized survivors, but I have story after story of public health collaborations between gun owners and non-gun owners, hospital workers and community violence interrupters, faith leaders and survivors. We have shown we can reduce the risk of a shooting long before someone picks up a gun with intent to harm. Through your bipartisan commitment to this public health approach, our country can reduce firearm injury and death for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ranney. I'm going to start with 5 minutes of questions and then turn over to my colleagues, each having the same opportunity. I listened to those who are critical of our even having this hearing and talking about this. There's so many more important things we can talk about. And yet, I just wonder if there's anything more important than life or death in your average neighborhood. Is there anything more important than knowing that that little boy or little girl that you sent to school this morning is safe in the classroom, doesn't have to hide under his desk, active shooter drills and exercises? You know, that really gets down to the basics. If you want to know about the safety of your family, it starts with the knowledge that when that child goes to school, he's going to come home safe at the end of the day. If you can't answer that question affirmatively, what in the hell are the rest of the questions worth? This, to me, is a fundamental issue, and it is a public health issue. It involves not hairstyles, it involves death by gunshot. And it's going on in America every single damn day. And we have a responsibility to do something up here. Not just to say we need to fund the police more. I'll sign up for that. We need to deal with mental health counseling. I'll sign up for that as well. But are we going to do some basic things like safety locks on guns so the kids can't play with them? Are we going to do anything basic like identifying people who should not even be considered owners of guns and take advantage of the gun store loophole? That to me is an example of what we can do that is just common sense. Some states have taken a lead on this and some may be surprising. Is there any restriction on buying a gun in the state of Wyoming, one of the most Republican states in the United States? Yes, turns out they have a state law that says you have to be 21 years of age. We're still debating this on a national basis. Even a conservative Republican state like Wyoming thinks that makes common sense. I agree with them. I want to ask a question. I have so many I got to ask, but Dr. Coney Gay and Mr. Bryan. And it really gets down to an experience I had thanks to Children's Memorial Hospital, Lurie Children's Memorial Hospital in Chicago. They gathered some gunshot victims together, and I met with them in private and said to them, okay, close the doors. This is off the record. What is it this old white guy ought to know about what's really happening in the streets of Chicago? Finally, when they loosened up and started giving me a response, it was a great day in my life. I learned a lot in a very short period of time. I'll never forget two who talked about the homes they grew up in. One young man, African-American man, said, Senator, I grew up in a house with no rules. When I woke up this morning and opened my eyes, I decided what time I'd get out of bed and whether I'd go to school. I decided whether I'd stay out on the streets all day and all night. I decided whether I'd buy drugs or guns. That was my decision. There were no rules in my house. I contrasted that with my own life. From the minute I opened my eyes in the morning until I closed them at night, there were rules flying at me in every direction. Get up, make your bed, brush your teeth, make your lunch, take care of your little sister, make sure that we have the dog out for a walk. And when you get to school, there's a nun waiting there with 100 more rules. And the penalty is to burn in hell if you didn't follow them. What a contrast in formative years. The second thing was a young woman who said, I was a mother. She was probably in her 20s. She said, I was a mother at the age of 14. It's the best thing that ever happened to me. I said, why? She said, my mother was a junkie. She brought boyfriends home, took advantage of her, and then turned to me. Finally, with that baby, I got out of that house and had a chance. I made something of my life as a result. Those are contrasting life experiences, which I don't know personally, but are part of this calculation. So let me ask the two of you. can we reach young people who've gone through those traumatic experiences and turn their lives around from violence? Doctor?
Thank you, Senator Durbin. First of all, thank you for sharing the story. And there's a phrase that I like to use that's connected to individuals that have lived similar lives, is that no one person should be judged by the worst thing that they've done in their lives. The work that we use, focusing on individuals that are survivors of violence, that have actually caused harm themselves, either in the hospital or on the community-based side, these are individuals that have desisted from that, but they've learned from that. They understand the impact that trauma has. That mom that was a junkie, there's a reason why that mom was a junkie. What the role that trauma has on the household impacts parental practices, monitoring, how parents and families monitor their children. We need to uplift the role that trauma plays in our society. I believe in this room we both agree that the impact that trauma has in terms of suicide rates, we take that same frame, we humanize, but we understand that the individuals that should be trusted to intervene are individuals that have led that lives themselves, and they're asking individuals to walk on the same path that they've walked on because they understand that path. When it comes to addressing issues connected to trauma, you have to really understand the role of trust. A lot of our systems, over time, trust has been eroded, and so having individuals that understand that life is an important first step.
Thank you. Mr. Bryant, you've got 30 seconds.
Yes, I would agree. I would add not only people with the lived experience, but also trained experts in mental health paired with those folks to work to heal our communities. The average age of the folks that we work with is about 31. So imagine a 31-year-old Black male who hasn't finished high school, never had a formal job. A lot of times they've grown up, similarly with no rules. And if we can get to those people and help heal those people, then they're going to be not only better for their communities, but they're going to be better for their families, because typically they're going to have kids as well. And a lot of the times that when we see youth getting shot, it's related to an adult in their lives that is living a life that, is not necessarily dignified. And all of our work is really around engaging, healing, and putting people on a path to living a dignified life.
Thank you, Mr. Bryant. Senator Cornyn.
The longer I've been in Washington, D.C. and worked in the United States Congress, the more I have come to believe that what divides us is not our goals so much as the means to achieve our goals. And here, obviously, we all would want to diminish and reduce violence in our communities. Mr. Cook, years ago, there was a Project Exile in Richmond, Virginia, I guess was the first place that a concentrated effort between federal, state, and local law enforcement efforts to focus on essentially repeat criminals, felons, possessing firearms, using firearms, committing other offenses, to target that aspect of violence in our communities. That's now become Project Safe Neighborhoods, which I mentioned has passed the Senate earlier this year. Given your experience as a federal prosecutor, can you describe the importance of focusing our time and resources on that small microcosm, really, of our communities that are committing most of the violent acts using firearms in our communities?
Yes, sir, I can. Let me first begin by thanking you for championing the Project Safe Neighborhoods reauthorization, and to the members of this committee who voted for that. Project Safe Neighborhoods, which was a spinoff from the wildly successful Exile project in Richmond, that project itself has continued, with the cornerstone being exactly what you said, and that is to take partnerships with federal prosecutors, state and local law enforcement, take those partnerships, identify the worst of the worst, and put them in federal prison. But Project Safe Neighborhoods really is more comprehensive than that. It also has other components. In our district, it was very successful. We had a 23% reduction in the first 4 years of the project, but it was more than just putting people in prison. That was the cornerstone, but we also had a reentry program. We also had an educational component. We also had a community interface component. So Project Safe Neighborhoods has continued to produce great results across the country, varying as high as 41% reductions in violent crime.
In addition to reauthorizing Project Safe Neighborhoods, what, in your opinion, what else should Congress be focusing on to make sure that we're dealing with this identifiable, recalcitrant criminal element that are responsible for most of the violent crimes in our communities?
Federal prosecutors need the tools back that I mentioned that have been taken away. First of all, as I said, finality in the federal criminal justice system has been gutted, and it's been gutted because the courts and the Sentencing Commission have taken the authority that Congress has given it through 3582, and they have run with it. And I think they've far outstripped the authority that Congress intended. So first, I would suggest that Congress put guardrails on 3582, serious guardrails. Secondly, I think that Congress needs to look at the Armed Career Criminal Act and the related statutes and make amendments that correct the narrowing that the Supreme Court has taken over the years, because those tools are fundamental to our ability to put those trigger pullers, those violent criminals who are the key to reducing violent crime. Those are the tools we need to put them in prison and keep them there.
Dr. Rainey, I applaud the efforts that you're undertaking. As you've heard, I have some questions about framing this as a public health crisis, but we'll leave that for discussion at another time. Let me ask you, in 2022, you did an interview with the American Medical Association where you said that mental illness is not a predictor of hurting others. Hatred is. Would you apply that to violent street gangs that are competing for territory and profits in communities across the country? Do you think it's hatred, or do you think it's something else?
Thank you, Senator Cornyn, and thank you again for your leadership with Senator Murphy on the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. As I outlined in my written testimony, studies have shown that people with serious mental illness are more likely to be victims of violence than perpetrators of violence. Substance use and antisocial personality disorder are risk factors for being perpetrators of violence. And of course, as you outlined, mental illness is deeply connected to firearm suicide, which is the leading type of suicide, of firearm death in this country.
In your experience, do people suffering mental health crises tend to frequently self-medicate, which exacerbates their dangerousness to themselves and others?
That can happen if there's inadequate access to mental health treatment. I think it is worth noting that when you actually look at mass shooters, the vast majority of them were in an identifiable crisis prior to that mass shooting, but only slightly more than the average American population have been identified as having serious mental illness. An awful lot of them are suicidal. And so there is an element of getting folks treatment and access to care. It's also about limiting access to lethal means at that moment of a crisis.
Thank you.